Welcome to Unrecorded Histories, your source for untold secrets, lost stories, and shocking facts. Subscribe now. The story of World War II did not begin with the gunfire of 1939 or the bombs of Pearl Harbor in 1941. It began in the shadows, through secret meetings, hidden agendas, and global deals made far away from ordinary citizens. What schools and history books often fail to tell us is this: the war was not simply the product of one man's ambition, but the result of decades of secret planning, global rivalries, and powerful nations playing dangerous games. The world after World War I was deeply wounded. Millions had died, empires had fallen, and treaties promised peace, but delivered punishment. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was supposed to prevent another great war. Instead, it humiliated Germany, crushed its economy, and planted seeds of revenge. In history classes, you might hear that Adolf Hitler rose to power because of his speeches and Germany's anger. But here's the hidden truth. Behind the scenes, powerful banks, corporations, and even some foreign governments quietly supported him. Why? Because they saw him as a shield against the spread of communism and a tool to restore German industry, something that would profit them financially. U.S. corporations like Ford and General Motors continued to do business in Germany during Hitler's rise. Banks on Wall Street were linked to German industry, proving that while politicians spoke of peace, money flowed into the pockets of war builders. If you're shocked by these hidden connections, pause for a second and hit that subscribe button right now, give this video a like, and share it with friends. More people need to learn what really led to World War II. After World War I, the League of Nations was created to prevent future wars, but history rarely mentions why it failed so miserably. Nations like Britain and France used it as a stage to appear moral while secretly cutting deals. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the League barely reacted. Why? Because the major powers were too busy protecting their own interests. The silence of the League sent a loud message to dictators. You can get away with aggression as long as it doesn't threaten the big powers. This weakness encouraged leaders like Hitler, Mussolini, and Japan's militarists to expand without fear. The Great Depression of the 1930s did more than ruin economies. It destabilized societies. Hungry people, jobless families, and desperate nations turned to extreme leaders who promised quick solutions. While ordinary citizens suffered, political elites in different countries saw opportunity. In Germany, Hitler promised bread, jobs, and revenge for Versailles. In Italy, Mussolini promised a return to Roman glory. In Japan, militarists promised expansion into Asia for living space. What's rarely told is how international investors helped stabilize these regimes. War became a profitable business long before it officially began. Before we continue revealing these shocking truths, make sure you've subscribed, given this video a thumbs up, and shared it. Together, we're exposing what history books covered up even before Germany invaded Poland in 1939. The world's powerful nations were maneuvering in secrecy. Britain and France practiced appeasement, secretly hoping Hitler would attack the Soviet Union and not them. The Soviet Union, realizing it was surrounded, signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany in 1939, a shocking deal that divided Eastern Europe in secret. Japan, hungry for oil and resources, eyed Southeast Asia and the Pacific, setting the stage for its clash with the U.S. Hidden in these moves was one truth. World War II was not an accident. It was the outcome of greed, fear, and manipulation at the highest levels of power. Most textbooks tell us World War II began when Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939. While technically true, it hides the deeper reality. Powerful nations let it happen because it suited their interests. The war was not just fought on battlefields, it was engineered in boardrooms, embassies, and smoke-filled back rooms long before the first shots. And while ordinary people prayed for peace, leaders quietly prepared for a war they knew was coming. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the skies above Hawaii turned dark with Japanese aircraft, and within 2 hours the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor lay in ruins. More than 2,400 Americans were killed, countless ships were sunk or damaged, and history would remember President Franklin D. Roosevelt's words, "A date which will live in infamy, That is the version we all learned in school. But what most textbooks don't tell us is this. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not a complete surprise. Evidence suggests that Washington had warnings, intelligence reports, and even clues that an attack was imminent. The real question is, did the U.S. government allow it to happen in order to justify entering the war? Long before the attack, Japan and the United States were already locked in a dangerous game of politics and economics. The U.S. had placed severe sanctions on Japan, cutting off oil, steel, and vital resources. Japan's empire, already stretched in China and Southeast Asia, faced collapse without new supplies. War was only a matter of time. American intelligence had cracked parts of Japan's secret communications, and intercepted messages suggested that something big was being planned. In the weeks before Pearl Harbor, several warnings were sent. On November 27, 1941, Washington sent a message to its military commanders stating, "This dispatch is to be considered a war warning." U.S. Ambassador Joseph Grew in Tokyo reported as early as January 1941 that Japan might strike Pearl Harbor if war broke out. British intelligence also passed along suspicions of a Japanese strike in the Pacific. Yet despite all these signs, the naval base at Pearl Harbor was left vulnerable. Why? At the time, much of the U.S. fleet was stationed in Hawaii, far from the mainland. Many historians ask, why keep so many valuable ships in one exposed harbor? The official reason given was deterrence, keeping Japan in check by showing strength. But critics argue that Pearl Harbor was left open as bait, a way to provoke Japan into making the first move. By doing so, Roosevelt could rally a divided American public, which until then strongly opposed joining another European war. Before December 1941, polls showed that nearly 80% of Americans wanted to stay out of foreign wars. But after the attack, outrage swept the nation. Overnight, isolationism collapsed, and the U.S. was fully committed to World War II. This sudden change makes many question whether the government's failure to act on warnings was incompetence or deliberate strategy. At exactly 7:48 a.m., waves of Japanese bombers and fighters descended on Pearl Harbor. Battleships such as the USS Arizona were torn apart in minutes. In all, 8 battleships were damaged, 4 sunk, along with cruisers, destroyers, and hundreds of aircraft. The attack crippled the fleet, but here's a detail many forget. America's aircraft carriers, the most important ships of the war, were not in the harbor that day. Some were out at sea, others in port elsewhere. By chance, or by careful planning, they were spared, and they would later become the backbone of America's victory in the Pacific. This has fueled theories that military leadership knew the attack was coming and ensured that their most valuable assets were kept safe, while older battleships, considered expendable, were left as sacrificial losses. Within hours of the attack, Roosevelt addressed Congress with his famous speech. The U.S. media, guided by government statements, portrayed Pearl Harbor as a shocking, unprovoked attack. The public was told that Japan had struck without warning, stabbing America in the back while peace negotiations were still ongoing. What they were not told was that the U.S. had pushed Japan into a corner with economic sanctions so severe that war became almost unavoidable. Nor were they told about the ignored intelligence reports pointing toward Hawaii as a target. This carefully crafted narrative unified the American people under one banner: revenge and total war. The attack not only brought the United States into World War II, but also reshaped global power. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S., expanding the conflict into a true world war. Pearl Harbor gave Roosevelt the political leverage he had long sought. He had believed for months that America could not stay out of the global conflict, but public opinion tied his hands. The attack freed him from those restraints. Meanwhile, Japan celebrated a temporary victory, but underestimated the industrial might of the United States. Instead of forcing America to negotiate, they awakened a giant that would ultimately crush them. Decades later, historians and researchers still debate the truth of Pearl Harbor. Did Roosevelt and his advisors know the attack was coming, but let it happen to bring America into the war? Was the placement of ships and defenses in Hawaii sheer negligence, or a calculated gamble? And why were the aircraft carriers, the most vital weapons of the future, conveniently absent on the morning of the attack? These questions remain unanswered because much of the evidence has been lost classified, or buried under official narratives. What we do know is this: Pearl Harbor was not simply a surprise. It was the turning point engineered by both Japanese desperation and American ambition. World War II in Europe is often told as a clear battle between good and evil, the Allies fighting against Nazi tyranny. But beneath the heroic tales lies a darker, hidden story. There were secret deals, betrayals, and suppressed truths that shaped the war far more than textbooks admit. Adolf Hitler's rise to power is usually described as a result of German anger and despair after World War I. While true, it leaves out the shocking fact that foreign investors, powerful banks, and industrialists fueled his climb. Companies like Standard Oil, IBM, and Ford were linked to German industries even as Hitler prepared for war. American and British financiers saw Nazi Germany as a wall against communism, so they quietly allowed the regime to grow stronger. Switzerland, though officially neutral, acted as a banker for Nazi gold, much of it looted from occupied countries and victims of the Holocaust. This support, silent but crucial, gave Hitler the tools he needed to build his war machine. In 1938, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia. The world remembers the Munich Agreement, when Britain's Neville Chamberlain returned declaring peace for our time. But behind the scenes, Britain and France essentially sacrificed Czechoslovakia, handing Hitler advanced weapons factories, tanks, and resources. Instead of stopping him, they strengthened him. This was not peace, it was preparation. Hitler gained confidence, and Europe slid closer to war. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the brutality was immediate. The Nazi war machine swept across Europe, leaving mass executions, forced labor, and starvation in its path. But here's what history books often minimize. While Nazi cruelty was undeniable, ordinary civilians across occupied Europe suffered in silence, their voices drowned in the larger narrative of battles and generals. Villages were wiped out, families deported, and cultures erased. Yet many of these stories rarely appear in classrooms. The Holocaust is remembered as one of history's darkest crimes. 6 million Jews, along with millions of Roma, disabled people, prisoners of war, and political dissidents were murdered. But there are layers of truth rarely spoken of. Early knowledge. Reports of mass killings reached Allied leaders as early as 1942. Yet large-scale rescue efforts were delayed. Why? Because winning the war was prioritized over saving lives. The role of collaborators. In many occupied countries, local police and officials helped round up Jewish families. The Holocaust was not carried out by Germans alone. It involved collaboration from across Europe. The Vatican's silence. The Catholic Church knew about the killings, but remained mostly silent. Some clergy helped victims, but the institution avoided direct condemnation of Hitler, fearing Nazi retaliation. The greatest tragedy is not only the killings themselves, but how much of the world already knew, and still chose silence. The Allied victory is often portrayed as a story of unity, but the reality was far more complicated. Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin were allies in name, but distrust ran deep. The Soviet Union bore the heaviest losses, with over 20 million dead. Yet Western histories often downplay this, focusing more on American and British battles. At the Yalta Conference in 1945, secret agreements were made that carved up Europe, handing Eastern Europe to Stalin's control. This laid the foundation for the Cold War before World War II had even ended. Britain, once the symbol of resistance, was deeply weakened by the war, and its empire began to crumble. The US and Soviet Union emerged as the true superpowers. When we think of war crimes, we picture Nazi atrocities. But hidden beneath the headlines are darker truths about the Allies themselves. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945 destroyed a cultural city filled with civilians, killing tens of thousands in a single night. Historians still debate if it was militarily necessary. Soviet troops, as they pushed westward, committed widespread atrocities, including mass rapes and looting, crimes that were often ignored or suppressed in official histories. Prisoners of war from Germany and Japan were sometimes treated harshly, in ways that violated the very principles the Allies claimed to uphold. The victors wrote the history, but that doesn't mean their hands were clean. Europe's dark secrets during World War II remind us that the war was not simply a battle of good versus evil. It was a complex struggle of nations protecting their interests, sometimes at terrible moral cost. The Holocaust stands as an undeniable horror, but the silence, the collaboration, and the delayed response of powerful nations reveal truths many would rather forget. And the secret bargains made before the war even ended remind us that, for leaders, politics often came before people. This is the part of history that remains in the shadows, the uncomfortable truths behind the official story. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, celebrations filled the streets of London, Paris, and New York. But in the Pacific, the war with Japan raged on. American leaders faced a choice: how to end the conflict swiftly without the bloodshed of a land invasion. The decision they made not only ended World War II, it changed the course of human history forever. On August 6, 1945, a U.S. bomber dropped the first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. In seconds, a city of nearly 350,000 people was engulfed in fire. Tens of thousands were killed instantly, and many more would die in the weeks that followed from burns and radiation. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki, killing tens of thousands more. Within days, Japan surrendered. The official story taught in schools is simple. The bombs saved millions of lives by avoiding a costly invasion. But here's what history often hides. Japan was already on the brink of surrender before the bombs fell. By the summer of 1945, Japan's situation was desperate. Its navy was destroyed. Its cities were devastated by relentless firebombing. It was cut off from vital supplies like oil and steel. The Soviet Union had declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. Historians have found evidence that Japanese leaders were seeking ways to negotiate surrender, provided the emperor could remain on the throne. This raises a haunting question. Was the use of atomic bombs truly necessary, or was it meant to serve another purpose? While ending the war quickly was one motive, there were deeper reasons behind the use of the bomb. A warning to the Soviet Union. The U.S. knew that after the war, tensions with the Soviet Union would define global politics. Dropping the bomb wasn't just about Japan, it was a show of force, a message to Stalin about America's new power. Justifying the enormous cost. The Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb, cost nearly $2 billion, over $25 billion today. With such an investment, there was immense pressure to demonstrate its success. Shaping post-war power. By using the bomb, the U.S. secured its place as the dominant power in the New World Order. It marked the dawn of the nuclear age, where America stood at the top. Before the atomic bombs, U.S. forces had already unleashed devastating firebombing campaigns on Japanese cities. In March 1945, the firebombing of Tokyo killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night, more than Hiroshima. Yet these horrors are rarely emphasized in textbooks. The atomic bombs overshadowed them, even though the suffering was equally catastrophic. For survivors known as hibakusha, life became a struggle not just against sickness and radiation, but also against the silence of a world that wanted to move on. After Japan's surrender, the world turned to questions of accountability. The Tokyo trials prosecuted Japanese leaders for war crimes, much like the Nuremberg trials in Germany. But justice was selective. The U.S. shielded certain figures, such as scientists involved in cruel human experiments, because their research was seen as valuable for America's Cold War ambitions. Victims were denied full justice, while knowledge from their suffering was absorbed into new military programs. The end of World War II did not bring peace, it brought a new kind of war. The Cold War began almost immediately. Europe was split between East and West. The United Nations was formed, but often served the interests of powerful nations. The nuclear arms race began, with the Soviet Union developing its own bomb by 1949. The world now lives under the shadow of nuclear annihilation, a legacy that still haunts us today. Looking back, the atomic bombings raise questions that have never been fully answered. Were they militarily necessary or politically calculated? Could Japan have been forced to surrender through blockade and diplomacy instead? Did the U.S. sacrifice hundreds of thousands of lives to shape the balance of power in the post-war world? The official story will always portray Hiroshima and Nagasaki as necessary evils. But when we peel back the layers, we find a darker truth. The end of World War II was also the beginning of a new age of fear, secrecy, and global competition. World War II is remembered as the Good War, a struggle where freedom triumphed over tyranny. But the truth is far more complex. From hidden deals before the war, to the ignored warnings at Pearl Harbor, to the silence during the Holocaust, and finally the atomic bombings that reshaped history. The war was not just a fight of armies. It was a chess game played by leaders, where ordinary people paid the ultimate price. The real story of World War II is not just about battles. It is about secrets, lies, and decisions made in shadows. And it reminds us that history, as told in classrooms, is only part of the truth. The rest remains hidden, waiting for those who dare to look deeper. Before you go, don't forget, subscribe to Unrecorded Histories right now and join our growing community of truth seekers. Smash that like button, share this video with friends, and turn on the bell so you never miss the hidden stories of history that others are too afraid to tell. Here at Unrecorded Histories, the past isn't forgotten, it's uncovered.